reduce complexity. By telling you that in a certain mode of presentation, putting a certain spin on the story, giving it a certain frame, I make it easy for audiences who don't understand the science, who will never understand the science because they're not having a PhD, they don't have a PhD in this particular field. Maybe they will understand the science better than they currently do, but they will never understand it the way scientists do. So now I need to convey this to audience members in 300 to 700 words. And how do I do this? By giving them essentially a framework to work with. Saying, look, this is just like something else. Look, you should think about this way. So it's not a tool to mislead, it's a tool to help information, to aid information processing. The problem that comes with that is that it reduces complexity, of course, but it also puts things in a certain bin. I want to show you two different slides here. One is the perceived risks of nanotechnology, and we asked this again both in 2004 and 2007. Here you only see the 2007 data, and we broke it down into people who were aware and unaware. And we asked about potential loss of privacy if people agreed or disagreed that those were potential risks. A potential arm race, and the privacy issue is what Susanna referred to earlier as something that also came out in her data again and again as one of the key concerns. The self-replicating robots, the speculation that we've had at, I don't know, a dozen meetings in DC about prey and its impact, probably not quite as strong as some people assumed it was, and then health and pollution, health risks and pollution. The interesting thing about this slide and why I'm putting it up is less about the absolute size of the risks than the difference between the aware and the unaware. There's really not much of a significant difference. In fact, none of these differences are significant. But what's interesting at this stage, if you look at the the benefits, and this is cleaning up the environment, a potential economic boom, energy solutions, and so on, improving human abilities, you find a consistent, significant difference between people who are aware of nanotechnology, who were aware, and people who are not. We asked them beforehand. Well, why is that? If it's not knowledge necessarily, and it is not knowledge. When we ran multivariate models, we looked at the impact of science media use and support for nanotech. Now that's the outcome in this particular case. What we found is, yes, there is a link, which would suggest, look, what happens is people learn more and then they're more supportive. Was not significant. In the multivariate models, once you control stuff out, it falls out. What stays in is essentially that optimistic framing effect. So the idea that people who have paid a lot of attention to science news and nanotechnology news pick up on the positive frames. They pick up on the optimistic interpretation without necessarily understanding the technology. So what we're seeing really in these early stages, and that's not extremely surprising, is the idea that people pick up on mostly positive framing, and that's beginning to change, and I'll talk about it. But in the process, don't necessarily, or certainly in our data, are not more informed. The second thing about framing that I want to talk about, and this is very much consistent with what Dan Kahan was presenting, is the idea that frames don't operate in a vacuum. It's not that we have 300 million Americans and they all react to the same messages the same way. So when we're talking about talking to the American public, that's a naive understanding and certainly not shared by anybody in marketing for that matter, or even in media in general. So people take, Dan Kahan would call them values or worldviews, and I would call them in part religious beliefs, moral schema, and so on. And they use those as filters to process new information. So it's not just that the worldview shapes your attitudes. It's that the worldview shapes how you interpret new information. So the exact same piece of information, even if it's framed in a particular way, will not be interpreted the same way by the same people. And let me show you this here for, and this is, I did not put this picture together. I'm pretty bad at Photoshop, but this is Dawkins and Jesus put together. Thank God for Image Google. But what it is essentially, what you see here is a link between two variables. One is on the x-axis down here, and I don't think I have a pointer here, but I'm going to try anyway. I do. You see the benefit perceptions influencing general support for nanotechnology. And obviously you would assume that this is, again, these are the positive frames that people pick up on across these 8 items average scale, that there's a positive link, right? The more benefits you see, the more supportive people are of nanotechnology. And that's there. But what's also there is, and this is again multivariate models, after all controls you still have a significant difference between highly religious people and less religious people. Where for the highly religious people, the impact of these frames, of positive frames on attitudes is much weaker than it is for less religious people. So in other words, less religious people apply less of that perceptual frame. It's therefore nanotechnology is obviously much stronger, for instance, for something like embryonic stem cell research, where we've done similar analyses, and it's not just, and again, this is the important takeaway here, it's not that the religiosity leads to attitudes. It's that the religiosity influences how these people process information and process frames, and how those frames then influence other variables. So based on that, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about and I guess I left the lessons on this slide, so a few thoughts on how to do it better. And I want to put one disclaimer out there, because this is certainly something that we've run into on a regular basis, and something that I feel quite strongly about, especially pieces that we've written for the scientists, for instance, where people came back and said, well, what you're promoting is really spinning science, and you're promoting a marketing of science. And in the very first slide, I had a picture of Larry Google, who went to AAAS, Larry Page from Google, who went to AAAS and said, look, people, you guys have a marketing problem. So he would certainly say, look, science needs to market itself better. I'm not arguing that, but I would like to caution against this dichotomy that we sometimes have, or seem to be talking about, that there's, you frame and you spin science versus you present information. And I would argue that the two are really fit together very nicely. You frame in order to get your information across, and you present it in certain ways in order to reach certain hard-to-reach audiences, audiences that usually don't pay particular attention to your message. So I don't think there's a discrepancy, and I don't think one really is in any way, shape, or form contradictory to the other. So what is effective, or what makes for effective communication? And I have